Everyday Samurai, Episode 63. Greetings, friends, and welcome to Everyday Samurai, in service to your liberty and the security of a free state. How do you do today? Have you ever heard the story of the man who worshipped dragons, enamored by them, had dragons on his clothes, decorated his house with all sorts of paraphernalia and regalia, revering the dragon, even had dragons on the fence outside of his house? Yet one day, as he was going about his business, a dragon came to his doorstep and said, "I'm here," at which point the man had a heart attack and passed away. The point of the story is that so often we try to emulate things that we think we want in our life until, of course, they show up. How often do we choose to pretend like we are something that we're not? Or we claim to be doing something when in fact we don't follow through. I bring this up because it's something that I experience in my own life, and I'm sure most people can relate. The story came to me originally through readings about the martial arts and how true it is when people say they like the idea of hard training in a martial discipline, but don't actually follow through. For many years, I went for days without actually exercising unless it was a day of training in a formal class. At some point, however, we have to take on the responsibility of recognizing that my training is my business, that if I want to be sincere about training in a martial art, I need to do the work every day on my own, whether there's class or not. So I take it upon myself to do the stretching and the preparatory exercises every day before dinner without fail, regardless of whether or not I'm going to engage in formal training or not. And it's created marked improvement in my whole experience of life, and recommend it, even if it's something that you can only do for a few minutes. Simply making the habit of performing your routine for physical preparation before dinner as a rule, recognizing that one of the biggest things is letting go of every excuse that you can find for not training. And there will always be a ready excuse at hand to distract you from your purpose. So it's not enough to simply lay claim to being a martial artist or to lay claim to wanting liberty. You have to actually do the work. We can also find this in all sorts of bypasses that we create for not actually doing the work, such as always needing to buy new equipment, the latest Gucci gear. And I have to admit that I was always a gear hound, always like having new tools and new equipment to play with, thinking that was going to solve the issue, regardless of whether it was in the tactical environment or even doing schoolwork, making sure I had the latest software program or some other thing that I thought was going to motivate me to do the actual work. But no, doing the work has to happen first within the concept of the mind. The motivation has to be within, and then you go about the business of getting down to business and then gathering tools as the need arises. Because quite often we find that the tool itself is not the solution. The right tool that you need will only be truly known when you're doing the actual work. And how many tools have I purchased that I never really used in a practical sense? But the purchase itself made me feel good without actually doing good. We see this a lot in the martial arts world and in the military world with adornments to uniform. That's one of the reasons why you can look at some places in the third world, what their general officers look like in dress uniform and all the medals and regalia hanging off of their chests. But do they actually do anything? Do they perform? How efficient are those militaries? Whereas something like the U.S. Marine Corps is very Spartan in its approach. They don't have a lot of medals. They don't rely on badges, yet they're also a very effective fighting force. Problem, of course, is the political policies to which they are applied. That was also my experience in the Army and all my other military training. I find that I got some of the best training in the world, got to go to some of the greatest schools and develop certain technical skills, but then in application, because of the misallocation of resources when it comes to politics, the missions were just farcical. And the same could be said for all of politics, particularly my experience in the war on drugs. Really enjoy having all the Gucci gear and the equipment and the training and getting all the guys together and get ready to go through the door, and love the fact that the tactical skills and the teamwork and the planning and all of the pieces that come together to make an operation happen makes me feel good cosmetically, but not actually thinking about the policy of what is it about the war on drugs that is so detrimental to society. Yes, of course, Drugs are harmful to people if you abuse them, but what is of greater harm to society is the violation of property rights, that people should be secure in their persons, houses, papers, and effects. And when any government or governmental agency or anyone acting as government takes liberty or license to violate the rights of someone else, even if they might be harming themselves, that imparts systemic risk and undermines social fabric. So I got into law enforcement specifically to fight the war on drugs and found out the hard way after long experience and much suffering of my own that I needed to ask more fundamental questions about what is the purpose of law? What is the purpose of government? And it's only through understanding political economy, through the causal realist dynamic, real causes and conditions in the real world among real people, not artificial models, that you start to distill down what is the real function of government, what is the real purpose of law. And the only method by which you can discern truth is by applying a universal standard. If this is the rule and it applies to everyone equally, what are the ramifications of that policy? So if you have some people that have the right to impose their will upon other people, and of course their property, the first property right is the human physical body, and everything else flows from that based on original appropriation, meaning mixing your labor with natural resources in the wild to cultivate them into usable goods and services. That's fine if you go out into the wilderness, but most people live in society. We come into community to enjoy the benefits of specialization and the division of labor, as well as all the social benefits of being in community, having contact with others. We are social creatures. And in fact, people that live alone, conceivably, do not need any liberty. Waking up on a deserted island, you don't need to assert a property right. Everything you see is yours. Property rights exist so that people can live together in relative harmony and in relative peace, free from most conflict. Isolated individuals don't need property rights, but using individual analysis is one of the ways that you can understand what should be the law. When is the use of force appropriate? And all martial artists, and I mean that in the term of individuals as well as professionals, military, law enforcement, high-risk security, need to contemplate when is the use of force justified. And it can't simply be because a book told me so. The unexamined life is not worth living. You have to think about why you're doing what you're doing. Now, getting back to the example of the person who was enamored with dragons, it's fine to have an avatar. In fact, it's a wonderful thing to hold up the vision of what the idealized character is. Lots of martial artists in the Japanese tradition are favorable to the Buddhist character Fudo-myo, who appears to be very grim and gruff and snarling and with a very focused gaze, holding a double-edged sword in one hand and a rope in the other. And it's a wonderful metaphor, recognizing that all of these gods in pantheistic religions are simply avatars of the one. Everything resorts back to a oneness, a fundamental unity that is the universe, the one song that is all existence, vibrating through all matter, time, and space beyond. Fudo-myo is a great character because he reminds people to stay on the straight and narrow, the sword that cuts through delusion and ignorance, and the rope that binds our passions so that we do abide with those universal laws. And there's all sorts of characters that we could adopt as models of perfect action. Growing up and watching action movies and seeing people like Arnold Schwarzenegger and Sylvester Stallone in their primes, and the posters that teenage boys used to hang on their walls were reminders that it was time to go to the gym. If you want to have that type of physique, you need to actually put in the work. So it's great to have a model of where you want to go or who you want to emulate. But it all resorts back to, what do you do with your time? Is it skillful? Does it advance your agenda and goals? Does it help contribute to the well-being of your fellow man and civil society as a whole? That's the idea of every individual needing to be personally disciplined. Not only does it lead to a better life, but it brings about a better society overall. That's the idea behind Everyday Samurai, is that we are in service to liberty, and it's our own liberty because we put in the time and the energy and the resources to improve ourselves, but then becoming so strong and so centered in principle that we have excess capacity to contribute to the well-being of a free state, in service to liberty and the security of a free state. And these principles are universal, even though they are rooted in the American tradition. I, being an American, but also someone who appreciates the samurai traditions, training in a samurai-related martial art. And again, there is that rather than being focused on ego aggrandizement and achieving accolades through sport fighting, armed engagement is entirely different. When you introduce lethality into training, the modality in which you train must completely change, plus critical uncertainties. And we recognize that the dojo is a very sterile place, rooted in myth, upholding an idealized fashion of engagement, because there is no reality whenever you start to put fixed rules into how the fighting will unfold. But you can't train with actual lethal weapons, so you have to impose rules that are artificial. So rather than trying to say that the cage or the ring is reality, dispense with the illusion of reality. There is no map that is the actual territory. The map is simply a representation, and the same thing with the dojo. Because lethality cannot be trained in realism, you have to impose rules and recognize that. It's okay to do scenario-based training. In fact, it's a wonderful thing to introduce those types of engagements simply for the gut check. That's one way, and there's other ways too. Adding a misogi minute to the end of your shower by turning it from hot to cold, and then seeing what your physical body does in reaction to it. Where does your mind go? There's a book by Brian Tracy called Eat the Frog or Eat That Frog. It talks about the first thing you should do in the morning is the hardest thing. If there's a task that needs to be accomplished, attack it first thing in the morning. And the same thing in meditation, that going into the mind and watching how it wanders and trying to quiet it through certain meditative techniques, even though you know you will never achieve it, simply pursuing that discomfort is part of your training. And it's a worthwhile endeavor because that's how we impose discipline. And again, the personal discipline that you derive through martial training, through mental training, through engaging in austerities, leads to your ability to accomplish more, to be more in line and act in accordance with who you really want to be, but then translating that into social contribution. And it is necessary to the security of a free state that the whole body of the people be organized, armed, and disciplined. And in fact, the absence of those necessary institutions is the leading indicator as to why there is so much political dysfunction, why there is so much encroachment upon people and their property, because the functions of government are off the rails. Key components are missing, and we do not need to invent any elaborate conspiracies or to engage in any esoteric speculations about prophecy or some weird conception of what needs to happen in order to right the ship of government. It is very, very clear. Constitution is a contract between free and independent states that in themselves are incorporated political entities that are cooperating with each other through this charter called the Constitution. And the Constitution makes it clear that the militia of the several states are the vehicle through which the general government executes the law, repels invasions, and suppresses insurrection. But there are no militia of the several states currently operating. There is nothing national about the militia of the several states, and in fact, the 1903 Dick Act that created the National Guard is prima facie unconstitutional, made in the so-called progressive era, made after the so-called Civil War that left many of the states unable to resist. And several decades later, the corruption and the political rot is manifest all around us. So I bring into your awareness this concept of appreciating dragons, but knowing also if you appreciate dragons, you need to do the work of being a dragon. If you love liberty, you have to do the work involved in securing your own liberty. And then, again, because no man is an island, do the work of securing a free state, learning how a republic is restrained in its function of the use of force, limited only to those things that are truly of a public nature. Res publica, not democracy. Democracy is two wolves and a sheep voting on what to have for dinner. It doesn't work. They are always displays of turbulence and violence in their death. Do not look to democracy, and in fact, dispel the notion of democracy at every chance you have. So last we left off in reading Dr. Edwin Vieira's By Tyranny Out of Necessity, The Bastardy of Martial Law. We were describing how the haves are leveraging political power and economic power against the have-nots and the used to have. And that is part of going into the discomfort. We know what the solution is, but until people admit that there's a problem and take it upon themselves, act in accordance with those principles of what makes for a free society and the functioning of well-ordered political economy, number one, money, and it needs to be sound money purchased on a free market and If it's still left in the hands of politicians, I don't know why it would be after they've bollocksed it up all these years. But in constitutional fashion, the general government was supposed to buy gold and silver on the free market and then coin it according to fixed weights and measures, issuing it then so that people can use it in transactions. But there was not supposed to be any paper money, certainly no fractional reserve banking, and no central banking. So the Constitution could have worked if the general government abided by those principles, but of course, all power is corrupting, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. So technology evolves, but the principle remains. Free market money, which in the future will likely be Bitcoin because it is fixed and it cannot be manipulated. And it's simply a natural evolution based upon humanity's technological capability. We've moved from the era of having photographs on film and Polaroid and things along those lines into digital space. The same thing with money. And it'll be a wonderful thing when we have cryptographically impervious money that politicians and bankers and other people acting on their own ignorance, avarice, and greed manipulate for their own benefit. So that will be a wonderful thing to level out and bring equality and natural order to the exchange of good using a common medium of exchange, namely money. Yet on the... Hey friends, imagine if you didn't have to battle with a busy mind and a restless body. Imagine if it took just a few minutes a day to set your mindset straight. And imagine if it brought instant results. Less stress, more happiness, greater focus, improved creativity immediately. Well, you can stop imagining. You see, today, I'd like you to know about an awesome audio meditation program called Zen 12. Zen 12 gives you a full hour's worth of deep meditation, all in just 12 minutes. It uses brainwave sounds to speed up the process, and it's genuinely unlike anything you've experienced before. I use this meditation program myself and recommend you do just as much. Just listen and experience the wonderful results. It's meditation for the modern world, for busy people, and it is the most efficient way to get the results that you need. Right now, you can get a free sample of this wonderful technology at everydaysamurai.life/Zen12. Your commitment to a mindfulness practice is essential to bringing your highest faculties online so you can perform your best at all you do, and Zen 12 can help you maximize the results. Check out everydaysamurai.life/Zen12. That's everydaysamurai.life/Zen12. Political side of the house, again, we're looking at political economy. Those two things cannot be separated. They need to be looked at always as dependent arising. So whenever you talk about money, you cannot leave the political aspect out. And when you talk about politics, which is supposed to be the administration of law, which is distilled down to the use of force, when is it legitimate to use force, there's always the consumption of resource because administering the law is a good and a service. Therefore, it requires resources. So you always have to ask who's paying, who's buying, who's providing, and what are the terms of that provision. Should be a contract. Government should be a contract. That's what the Constitution was supposed to be. The problem is a lack of enforcement. Why is there a lack of enforcement? Because the key component of enforcement is missing. What is that key component? The militia of the several states. What does that require? It requires everyone to be organized, armed, and disciplined. You see how everything traces back in a logical fashion, and it all comes down to individuals doing the right thing. And that includes going into discomfort, thinking about what the ideal is, recognizing that there's a gap from where you are to where things should be, and being okay with that. That's also part of the discipline. Practicing mindfulness, having that ideal, recognizing that there is space between, and that might cause great discomfort, but that's also part of the discipline for making corrective action. So as we read now in Dr. Edwin Vieira's By Tyranny Out of Necessity, chapter 3, we're seeing what we don't want. We're seeing just how corrupt things are. We're seeing how those powers that shouldn't be are using their privileged position to oppress the rest of the population. And it's wrong and it's a crime, but nothing's going to change until the configuration of institutions change in the use of force. And that, of course, requires having an understanding of what law should be. Do all you have agreed to do not encroach upon other people or their property. With that, we have the basis of contract law and criminal torts. So we don't need to figure out what the new law system should be. The law is very simple, focused on private property and enforced by we the people. Common law, universally applicable to everyone at all times. The challenge is, how do we get there? Starts by waking up within us what is the right thing, taking action on an individual basis, becoming so strong that we can contribute to the well-being of our fellow man through service, and then also influencing others to take that journey, to dive into the discomfort and embrace the discipline in the mental, physical, spiritual, and secular realm. So I'll continue. Now Americans are being told that within the assumption of heretofore unheard of broad executive power lurks a supposed license for public officials to impose martial governance, not in some conquered foreign capital, but in the streets of their very own cities, today upon essentially any pretext which can be related, however intangentially, to the war on terrorism, as in Watertown, Massachusetts after the Boston Marathon bombing, tomorrow, in response to any chronic domestic, economic, social, or political disturbance against which the Homeland Security establishment decided to announce a new front in that war, with the imposition of martial governance arrives the law of war as the new basis for domestic government of potentially all Americans, including the vast majority which is innocent of any possible thought, let alone taint of terrorism. And the advent of martial governance and the law of war ends the consent of the governed once and for all. Because even in a form less virulent than martial governance, martial law applies to civilians and involves the substitution of a military regime and military tribunals in a whole community in place of the ordinary processes of justice. Yet the architects of the war on terrorism have never afforded common Americans any meaningful say as to whether they approve or even understand the origins and consequences of the imposition of this alien and draconian form of ersatz law upon them. And most Americans do not realize that martial law, let alone martial governance, is built upon no settled principles, but is entirely arbitrary in its decisions, and is, in truth and in reality, no law, but something indulged rather than allowed as a law. Obviously, that rogue public officials' complots to clamp down with martial governance on this country have matured to the degree to which they have, without significant resistance, remonstrance, or even recognition from a large segment of America's population, augurs ill for the continued vitality of the land of the free. That rogue officials would even consider martial governance as an option evidences their antagonism towards we the people. They think nothing of compounding their own record of economic crimes perpetrated against the people with a new round of political crimes directed at the people, victimizing the people in the future by the obliteration of their liberties, because the people may finally object to having been victimized in the past through the pillaging of this country's economy. That rogue officials would openly prepare for martial governance demonstrates their disdain for we the people. Although the representatives of the United States of America asserted in the name and by the authority of the good people of the colonies that these united colonies are, and of right ought to be, free and independent states. To rogue officials, the Declaration of Independence means nothing, and it could hardly be otherwise, inasmuch as the Declaration completely repudiated even the form of martial law familiar in that era, which was mild indeed in comparison to martial governance. Moreover, officialdom's disdain extends beyond the good people themselves and beyond the Declaration as their first act of sovereignty, to the very laws of nature and of nature's God, on the authority of which the good people originally assumed, among the powers of the earth, the separate and equal station to which they were entitled. Furthermore, although we the people ordained and established the Constitution, to rogue officials the Constitution means nothing, and once again, it could hardly be otherwise, because the Constitution, too, provides not a scintilla of legal support for martial governance. In addition, although the first principle of American political science is that this country has a government of the people, by the people, for the people, at every level of the federal system, rogue officials do not look to the people for leadership, notwithstanding that the people are this country's only sovereigns, or for assistance, notwithstanding that the people constitute the repository of the ultimate physical as well as political and economic power in this country, or even for approval, because martial governance does not depend upon the people's assent, but instead aims at enforcing order on them in defiance of their disappropriation. Here as well, it could hardly be otherwise, because if rogue officials acknowledged the people as the human source of all political authority, they would have to concede their subordination to the people, and then confess to the illegitimacy of the many powers they have usurped from the people or stitched together out of whole cloth, woven on the looms of tyranny. That rogue public officials express their confidence that they can successfully impose martial governance at will exhibits their utter contempt for we the people. Evidently, they imagine that the vast majority of the people will turn out to be composed of timid attentistes who will simply sit on the political fence, abiding events inevitably to acquiesce in whatever officialdom demands from them. Of the remainder, most of those who will decry martial governance will never attempt to stand up against it, even by non-violent means. And the very few who might fight in an extremis will quickly be repressed by the ruthless brutality and overwhelming firepower of the police state apparatus. Once more, it could hardly be otherwise, because only individuals who were willfully blind to the real balance of forces in their society could believe themselves capable of setting up a nationwide concentration camp for more than 300 million people without having to overcome mammoth resistance. No matter how self-confident rogue officials may appear in the pretensions they broadcast for public consumption, that they must pull the trump card of martial governance out of their sleeves betrays their visceral fear of we the people. They know that the people have the sheer numbers, the actual day-to-day physical control over most of the property, and especially the legal right of popular sovereignty on their side. They know that the people are armed, both in point of fact and with constitutional right to keep and bear arms, which shall not be infringed, and that this alone could prove to be decisive, because in the final analysis, political power grows out of the barrel of a gun, and the sword and sovereignty always march hand in hand. They know that the people are sick and tired of rogue officialdom, and are rapidly exhausting their patience, if they have not already gone beyond the point at which, as the Declaration of Independence described matters, mankind are more disposed to suffer while evils are sufferable than to right themselves by abolishing the forms of government to which they are accustomed. And they should know that martial governance is not an ace in their hand, but only a deuce. For as shall appear anon, there is no such thing as martial governance as officialdom imagines it. That is, a body of law imposed by military force which overrides the people's sovereignty. Rather, the only form of martial law which the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution countenance as a means for governing very large numbers of civilians under extraordinary conditions consists of the laws of the Union and the several states, which the people themselves execute through the militia of the several states. This may be called martial law in a loose sense, because it is enforced by martial institutions, the militia of the several states. But it is not martial law in the strict sense that it is based upon some narrow code of military justice. Rather, it aims at establishing justice in the full constitutional sense, by seeing to the governance of the just powers, and only such powers, which America's form of government derived from the consent of the governed. And were it properly executed today, it would strike the hardest precisely at rogue officials. And here ends Chapter 3 of Dr. Edwin Vieira's By Tyranny Out of Necessity, the Bastardy of Martial Law. We will pick up with Chapter 4 in the next broadcast. Friends, we hope you've enjoyed this episode of Everyday Samurai and look forward to seeing you next time. Be sure to like and share the show with a friend. Find someone that you think might resonate with this message of building liberty and securing a free state. Until next time, stay sharp, stay aware, and be well.